Imagine you are holding a bag of ordinary salt in your hand. Cheap, everyday, boring. We use it to melt snow on our driveways. We sprinkle it on our eggs without a second thought. It is the most mundane substance in our lives. Now, I want you to forget everything you think you know about it. Because once, for a handful of this white powder, people gave up land, freedom, and life. It wasn't just a spice. It wasn't just a preservative. It was a key. When I started tracing the old salt roads, something felt wrong immediately. They didn't stretch out like random trader paths, winding through the path of least resistance. They looked like a precise network. They connected star-shaped forts to strange domed cities where giant basins, wells, and underground tunnels stood right next to the salt depots. Official history says it was just trade and taxes, but the maps, the plans, and the old photos whisper something else. They whisper that salt was feeding something bigger: water machines, pressure systems, the energy of an entire world that someone later worked very hard to erase from memory. If that's true, then we didn't just underestimate salt. We failed to notice the skeleton of a forgotten civilization beneath our roads. I was not looking for a lost civilization. I was looking for salt. It began, like many strange stories do, with a map I was never meant to notice. I was in a university archive, digging through a box of uncatalogued logistical charts from the mid-19th century. The air smelled of dust and decaying paper. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining outside, the kind of gray light that makes old ink look almost black. I pulled out a brittle, fading sheet labeled with one dry line: Principal Salt Routes of the Eastern Territories, 1847. I expected donkeys. I expected dirt roads. I expected a few merchant caravans winding through mountains, avoiding the steep climbs, following the easy valleys. The usual picture our school books paint for us of a primitive, muddy past. But what I found instead felt like a glitch in the timeline. The routes did not meander like trade paths. They ran straight. Impossibly straight. They cut across the landscape with a geometric aggression that made no sense for horse-drawn carts. I ran my finger along the line from Wielicza in Poland to Salzburg in Austria. It was a direct connection, ignoring natural obstacles. Then I looked at the destination points. These salt roads didn't just end at market towns. They linked points that should have had nothing in common. Star-shaped fortresses, domed cities, enormous basins carved into the earth. And at every junction, every crossing, every single node on this grid, there was a salt depot. But these weren't depots. I pulled up the architectural sketches for the buildings labeled as storage on the map. They were palaces. They were massive stone complexes with vaulted ceilings that soared 40 feet high. They had defensive towers, precise geometric walls, and deep underground chambers. Ask yourself something honest. Why would anyone build a fortress with precise geometric walls and deep underground chambers just to store table salt? Why would you defend a condiment with the same engineering you use to defend a king? The official explanation is simple. We have heard it since childhood. Salt was valuable. It preserved food. Kings taxed it. The end. But that neat little story snapped the moment I started measuring the map. The more I compared the lines, the less it looked like trade and the more it looked like design. I pulled up satellite imagery of the old salt cities: Wielicza, Cardona, Aigues-Mortes, places that history books file under medieval salt towns. Then I overlaid them on the 1847 map. They matched perfectly. Not roughly, not close enough. Down to the walls, down to the wells, down to the underground tunnels that official records insist were not built until the industrial age. Something was wrong. Because these structures, these clean, precisely aligned, impossibly advanced complexes were not thrown together by peasants hauling sacks. They were not simple tax stations for local lords counting coins. They felt inherited. That was the moment the archive room went silent for me. I realized I wasn't looking at a map of commerce. I was looking at a schematic. I was looking at a circuit board printed on the geography of Europe. The salt roads were the wires. The depots were the capacitors. And the salt itself? The salt was the conductor. The closer you study the pattern, the more it seems that someone erased this system on purpose. Depots renamed as warehouses, fortresses relabeled as customs houses, an entire network quietly downgraded from technology to local tradition. But the maps do not lie. The geometry does not lie. And the salt, silent, white, and hiding in plain sight, does not lie either. So, The main question is simple and terrifying. Who and why turned the salt road of Tartaria from the energy artery of the old world into a cheap white powder sitting on a supermarket shelf? To understand that, we have to stop looking at the roads and start looking at what was flowing underneath them. I pulled up satellite imagery of the old salt cities. I didn't want drawings anymore. I wanted the hard truth of the ground itself. I started with Wieliczka in Poland, then moved to Salzburg in Austria, Cardona in Spain, and Aigues-Mortes in France. These are places that history books file away under medieval salt towns or quaint tourist destinations. But when I overlaid their layouts onto the 1847 map, the result was chilling. They matched perfectly, not roughly, not close enough. The alignments were exact, down to the angles of the walls, down to the placement of the wells, down to the underground tunnels that official records insist were not built until the industrial age. Something was wrong. Because these structures, these clean, precisely aligned, impossibly advanced complexes, were not thrown together by peasants hauling sacks of salt. They were not simple tax stations for local kings counting coins. They felt inherited. And that was the moment I understood what I was really looking at. Not trade routes, not medieval commerce, not a simple story about food preservation. No, I was looking at the skeleton of something much older, something that used salt not as a product, but as a component, a key, a piece of machinery we no longer know how to read. Take Wieliczka, for example. The official story is heartwarming. We are told that over centuries, devout Catholic miners, working in poor light with primitive pickaxes, carved out massive underground cathedrals just because they were bored or pious. They carved chandeliers out of rock salt. They carved acoustic halls that rival the best opera houses in Europe. They carved intricate geometric floor patterns hundreds of meters underground. Does that sound like the work of exhausted laborers trying to meet a quota? Or does it sound like the repurposing of a space that was already there? I looked at the floor plans of the Wieliczka chapels. They don't follow the chaotic, organic lines of a mine following a vein of ore. They follow strict geometry. Rectangles, perfect circles, vaulted domes. The chandeliers are not just decorative. They are made of crystallized salt, a material that reacts to humidity and vibration. The entire complex acts like a giant resonant cavity. If you strike a note in the lower chambers, it travels. It doesn't dampen, it amplifies. Miners don't need acoustics, but a machine does. A frequency generator does. Then I moved my search to France, to the Royal Saltworks at Arquetis-Senans. The history books call it a visionary industrial project by the architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux in the 1770s. A factory designed to produce salt. But look at it. Look at the plan. It is a perfect semicircle. The director's house sits at the focal point, with 11 buildings radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. It looks less like a factory and more like a particle accelerator, or a lens. The archives mention underground chambers beneath the director's house, chambers that were sealed in the 19th century. Sealed. Why? If it's just a factory, what is down there that needs to be hidden? No diagrams, no notes, just a quiet administrative line, closed and filled. The silence around these spaces is deafening. And then there is Cardona in Spain, a salt mountain, an entire hill of solid salt, crowned by a massive fortress monastery that predates any written record of its original construction. Officially, the fortress exists to guard the valuable resource beneath it. But the fortress sits exactly at the apex of the salt dome, the geometric center, the one point where, if you were designing a pressure system, you would place your main regulator, your master valve. Coincidence? I stopped believing in coincidences months ago. Everywhere I looked, the same pattern repeated. Salt palaces set down with mathematical precision. Underground chambers aligned not to whim, but to geological faults and aquifers. Surface architecture that mirrors an invisible infrastructure below, like a reflection of the machine hidden underground. And always the same Tartarian fingerprints. Star-shaped foundations, domed central buildings, radial symmetry, water basins built directly into the plan, not as decoration, but as structural elements. These complexes were not built by the kingdoms that later stamped their coats of arms on the walls. They were found. They were occupied. They were renamed. And then, slowly and deliberately, they were stripped of their original function. This leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. If these structures were inherited, If later rulers simply moved into someone else's system, then who was the real builder? I went back to the old texts. I looked at the margins of forgotten atlases. And there, in a French atlas from 1737 describing the Great Eastern Salt Road, I found a reference to the Tartarish Salver, Tartarian salt works. The text listed cities I had never heard of. Fortifications built around salt springs. A chain of hydraulic stations that supplied the empire with the white blood of the earth. White blood, not a spice, a life force. The architecture matches. The domed roofs, the strict geometric layouts, the tight relationship between water, salt, and deep underground chambers. Separated by thousands of miles, yet linked by a design language official history refuses to name. A civilization that built with salt and water, not just stone and wood. That laid out hydraulic networks across entire continents. That clearly understood something about pressure, flow, and energy that we have either forgotten or been encouraged to forget. I was standing on the bones of a dead giant. The flesh was gone, the name was erased, but the skeleton, the salt grid, remained. And now that I knew what the bones looked like, it was time to find out how the muscle worked. How do you turn a static pile of salt into a power source? The answer wasn't in the history books. It was in the physics of water itself. But seeing the grid raised a new question, one I had been quietly avoiding. If salt and water were the components of a machine, how did that machine actually work? I am not an engineer. I am not a physicist. But the question would not let me go. If the salt road was designed to move energy, not just goods, then there had to be a mechanism, a principle, a reason why salt water would matter more than ordinary water. So, I started reading. I dug into old engineering manuals with yellowed pages, hydraulic textbooks that nobody borrows anymore, and forgotten papers on the behavior of brine in pipes and wells. And then, I found it. The answer is so simple that it hides in plain sight. Salt water is heavier than fresh water, roughly 2 to 3% denser, depending on the concentration. On paper, that difference looks tiny. It sounds like nothing. But in a hydraulic system, that tiny difference changes everything. Imagine two vertical columns of water side by side, connected at the bottom like a giant U-shape. One column is filled with fresh water, the other is filled with heavy, concentrated brine. Gravity pulls harder on the brine. The heavier salt water pushes down, and the lighter fresh water is forced up. You get movement. You get flow. You get a pressure difference you can use. No pumps. No engines. No external power source at all. Just salt, water, and gravity doing the work. Engineers today call this density-driven flow. It is the same principle behind certain kinds of deep-sea currents that circle the planet. But here is what stopped me cold. The old salt stations were built exactly to exploit this principle. I looked again at the diagrams of the depots. Deep brine wells tied into elevated basins. Underground channels running from high salinity sources up toward lower salinity outlets. Chambers laid out to separate heavy, concentrated brine from lighter, diluted water. The architecture I had been staring at for months was not just beautiful, it was functional. Those vaulted ceilings? They weren't only for show. They created temperature differences between high and low air layers to encourage evaporation, increasing salinity. Those vast central basins? They were mixing chambers, precisely placed so that changes in density would produce a constant, gentle push. A continuous flow that never really stopped as long as water and salt were present. I found diagrams from the 18th century showing brine lifting systems that used no mechanical power. No water wheels, no steam engines, just the careful control of salt concentration at different depths. I found descriptions of self-flowing wells that seemed to pump water uphill, something that sounds impossible by normal intuition, unless you understand how brine density can be turned into a tool. Suddenly, the impossible engineering of the past started to make sense. Look at the brine pipelines of Reichenhall in Bavaria. Wooden tubes carrying salt water over mountains and across valleys through pressure systems that the official timeline says should not have been possible before the industrial age. The first documents appear in the 16th century, yet the level of engineering hints at something much older. How did they move that water without high-pressure pumps? They didn't. They let the weight of the brine do the work for them. In China, the Zhejiang salt wells used bamboo pipelines and natural gas drilling methods in the 3rd century. Technology Western engineers wouldn't discover for another 1,500 years. In the Carpathian Mountains, ancient salt springs are ringed by carved stone channels that lead into basins, then into secondary channels, and finally into underground systems that have never been fully surveyed. This was not random. This was engineering. And the most revealing detail? The salt depots didn't just sit at the ends of these water systems. They were placed exactly where water pressure would peak, where steep drops, bends, or sudden elevation changes could generate force. I began overlaying depot locations on topographical maps, and the pattern stopped being guesswork. Every major salt station sat at a pressure point. It was as if the entire network, the canals, the rivers, the subterranean channels, the brine pipelines, had never been designed mainly to move salt from mine to market. It had been designed to move energy. Salt water running downhill, pressure building in underground chambers, force traveling through channels into stations that took that raw power and converted it. This explains the white blood reference in the Tartarian Atlas. Blood circulates oxygen. It keeps the body alive. This network circulated pressure. It kept the cities alive. The Salt Road was a continental circulatory system, a clean, silent, self-sustaining power grid that required no combustion, no smoke, and no coal. It ran on the physics of the Earth itself. But a circulatory system needs a heart. It needs a pulse. And that is where the story shifts from the ground beneath our feet to the air above our heads. Because once you have the energy flowing, you need a way to broadcast it. And that is why they built the towers. If the salt roads were the arteries, the bells were the voice. I had spent months tracing the silent flow of brine beneath the earth, but every circuit needs an output. Every power plant needs a transmission line. And in the old world, they didn't use copper wires strung on ugly wooden poles. They used sound. They used vibration. They used the massive bronze bells that crowned every city, every town, and every star fortress in the empire. Until the day someone decided to turn them off. The year was 1917. The official history books tell us this was the year of the Russian Revolution, a time of chaos, war, and political upheaval. They tell us that the new Bolshevik government, desperate for resources to fight a civil war, issued a decree. All surplus ecclesiastical metal is to be confiscated for the needs of industry. It sounds logical. It sounds practical. Cannons need bronze. Bullets need casing. Bells are heavy and made of metal. Simple math. But in the autumn of 1968, in a sealed suburb of Leningrad, a clerk opening a mislabeled wooden crate found something that makes that simple math fall apart. The crate was inventory number 44B, labeled requisition church metal, 1917, melted 1920. Inside, however, there was no slag. There were no receipts for artillery shells. There was only a set of black and white photographs. They showed massive bronze bells being lowered from towers in Kazan, Tomsk, and Samarkand. The men in the photos looked small, like ants next to these metal giants. But look closer at the captions. On the back of one photo, in hurried pencil, someone had written a date, March 12, 1917. I cross-referenced this with the official transport manifest from the Petrograd foundry. The official record says that this specific bell, a monster 7.3 meters in diameter, arrived at the foundry on March 17th. Do you see the problem? The bell was listed as processed and melted 5 days before it supposedly arrived. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a pattern. I found more discrepancies. A foundry in Tula listed a shipment of church scrap received in February 1918, yet the demolition order for those specific churches wasn't signed until June. The records were being faked. The paper trail was a lie designed to cover up a removal operation that had started long before the war provided a convenient excuse. And then there are the witness accounts. Buried in the diaries of everyday people living in Petrograd and Moscow during that terrible winter, a strange detail keeps surfacing. They don't talk about the silence of the bells. They talk about the silence of the air. On March 5, 1917, the day the provisional government signed the confiscation decree, the weather was raw and damp. Witnesses recall sleet streaking down the windows of the Winter Palace. But one foundry worker, whose oral history was recorded on a reel-to-reel tape in 1935, mentioned something else. He said, "When they took the great bell down, you could feel it in your teeth, like standing near a dynamo that just stopped spinning. The air felt thin. It felt dead." He wasn't describing a loss of music. He was describing a drop in pressure. Another account from a typist in the People's Commissariat of Finance describes an engineer named Melnikov. While other clerks were tallying weights and measures, Melnikov was testing the bells with a strange device he pressed against his jaw. He joked that the bells carried the weather in them. He claimed that when certain bells were struck, the fog outside would lift. When they were silenced, the gray set in. Melnikov's name was later crossed out of the personnel ledger with thick red ink. His file is empty. What were they really removing? If you need metal for war, you melt statues, you melt railings, you melt roof copper. You don't spend weeks engineering complex pulley systems to lower 40-ton bells from fragile towers without scratching them. You don't carefully crate them. You don't photograph them like scientific specimens before destroying them. The 1917 decree was not a recycling program. It was a disconnect order. The new regime, the one bringing in coal, oil, and the centralized electric grid, could not afford to have a competing frequency broadcasting over the cities. They couldn't have the population tuning into a free, atmospheric energy source. They needed the old transmission towers gone. So they called it modernization. They called it atheism. They called it the war effort. But when you look at the photos of the bell graveyards, fields of bronze giants lying on their sides in the snow, they don't look like scrap heaps. They look like a dismantled power station. And the most terrifying part? They didn't melt all of them. Some were taken away intact. Some were diverted to Laboratory 3, a facility that appears on no map. Because the engineers of the New World knew exactly what the bells were. And they wanted to know how the machine worked before they buried it forever. To understand why the bells were silenced, you have to look inside one. And I don't mean just peeking under the rim. I mean looking at the engineering blueprints that were supposed to be destroyed. We all think we know what a bell is. A simple, hollow cup of bronze with a clapper inside. You swing it, the clapper hits the side, it makes a noise. Primitive. Simple. But that is the standardized bell, the version we were allowed to keep after the Great Silencing. The bells of the old world, the ones documented in the destroyed archives, were something else entirely. The breakthrough came when I found a digitized glass plate negative from the Kazan foundry, dated April 1918. It showed a bell that had been sliced in half, presumably for melting. But the interior wasn't smooth. It wasn't the empty chamber we expect. The inner walls were engraved with deep, concentric channels, rising in a perfect spiral from the rim to the crown. It looked less like a musical instrument and more like the inside of a threaded screw, or a coil. The official caption on the photo dismissed it as decorative fluting. But that makes no sense. Why would a master craftsman spend months carving intricate geometric spirals on the inside of a dark bell where no human eye would ever see them? You don't decorate the inside of an exhaust pipe. You don't decorate the inside of a piston. You only shape the interior of an object if the shape itself does something. I kept digging. I found a purchase order from a private foundry in Nizhny Novgorod, dated June 3, 1903. It was a commission for a principal bell, experimental pattern, ordered by an engineer identified only as VA. The surname had been scraped off the paper. Attached to the order was a fragmented sketch, a cross-section of the bell's wall. The sketch labeled the internal spiral channels not as decoration, but as waveguides. It marked specific cavities near the crown as resonant chambers. And in the margin, written in a hurried, distinct hand, was a note. Ensure alignment to magnetic north. Refer to Tart Schema number 7. Tart Schema. Tartaria. I took these sketches to a friend who works in microwave engineering. I didn't tell him where they came from. I just showed him the cross-section of the bell with its internal spirals and cavities. He didn't ask about music. He asked, "Is this a magnetron?" He explained that in high-energy physics, you use specific geometric shapes, cavities and spirals, to trap and amplify electromagnetic waves. A cavity magnetron is the heart of a radar system. It's the heart of a microwave oven. It resonates at high frequencies to generate power. If you scale that design up to the size of a 20-ton bronze bell and you strike it, or stimulate it with the right atmospheric charge, you aren't just making a sound. You are creating a field. Suddenly, the decorative spirals made terrifying sense. These bells weren't designed to ring for the ears of the faithful. They were massive, resonant machines designed to interact with the electromagnetic field of the Earth itself. The spiral channels guided the energy. The bronze alloy, often found to contain traces of silver and unknown crystalline phases in the older samples, acted as the conductor. This is why they had to be destroyed. You can't just repaint a machine like that. You have to disassemble it. In 1929, a committee convened in Moscow at the People's Commissariat of Heavy Industry. Their mandate was standardization. The minutes of the meeting are dry, boring, and horrifying. Item 4 on the agenda reads, eliminate previously used non-standard internal profiles. All future bells to follow simplified schema per attached diagrams. One engineer, a comrade Raghav, is recorded as arguing to keep the internal channels, claiming they improved acoustic carry. The minutes note his objection was overruled as bourgeois attachment to old forms. Raghav disappears from the personnel files a year later. Following this meeting, a directive went out to the few remaining bell foundries. They weren't just ordered to stop making the old bells, they were ordered to alter the existing ones. I found a confidential report from a museum restorer in the 1970s. She noted that many pre-revolutionary bells showed signs of deliberate regrinding. Someone had gone in with tools and filed the internal grooves flat. They had filled the resonant cavities with lead solder. They didn't just break the bells. They lobotomized them. They smoothed out the complex, functional geometry of the old world and left us with dumb, hollow shells that make a nice noise but do nothing else. The machine was stripped of its components until it looked like a harmless tradition. But the blueprints remain, the photos remain, and the physics of sound and shape do not change just because a government burns the books. We know now that the bell was a machine. The next question is, what happens when you turn that machine on? What happens to the air, the weather, and the human body when a 20-ton magnetron starts to sing? We know the bells were machines. We know they were connected to a continental energy grid. But the question remained, what were they actually broadcasting? The answer was hiding in a line of text that someone tried, and failed, to erase from a 1922 inventory ledger. Remember the engineer I mentioned? Melnikov, the man who was purged for testing the bells with his jaw? Before his file vanished, he managed to scrawl a note in the margin of a register listing confiscated church bronze. Next to an entry for a bell from the Tartar district, he wrote, resonance test positive. Fundamental frequency, 7.83 Hz. Consistent with atmospheric pulse. 7.83 Hz. To a historian, that number is meaningless. To a physicist, it is the holy grail. 7.83 Hz is the Schumann resonance. It is the electromagnetic heartbeat of the Earth. It is the frequency generated by lightning strikes circling the globe, bouncing between the ground and the ionosphere. But here is the catch. German physicist Winfried Otto Schumann didn't officially discover or calculate this frequency until 1952. Melnikov wrote that note 30 years before modern science admits we knew it existed. The implications are staggering. The old world engineers didn't just stumble upon a nice sound. They had tuned these massive bronze oscillators to the exact frequency of the planet itself. I needed to confirm this. The archives gave me paper, but I needed physics. I tracked down a report from a small acoustics lab in Vienna, dated March 19, 1993. A graduate student named Lucas Steiner had received a bronze shard from a private collector in Russia, a jagged piece of metal claiming to be from a bell destroyed in 1917. Steiner placed the fragment under a laser vibrometer. He struck it. The lab notebook records his confusion. The bronze didn't just ring and fade. It held a low-frequency hum, a phantom tone, that persisted long after the audible sound died away. The frequency? You guessed it. A steady, unyielding resonance near the 8 Hz band. The metal itself was engineered to lock onto the Earth's signal. Why does this matter? Why would a government be so terrified of a frequency that matches the Earth? Because 7.83 Hz isn't just a planetary number. It is a biological one. It happens to be the frequency of the human brain in a state of deep relaxation and healing, the alpha/theta border. It is the state where regeneration happens. It is the state where stress dissolves. Imagine a city where giant bells ring out every hour, not to tell time, but to broadcast a healing field. A city where the architecture itself acts as an amplifier, flooding the streets with a vibration that keeps the population healthy, calm, and connected to the natural rhythm of the planet. It was a civilization built on harmony. And that is exactly why it had to be destroyed. The New World, the world of 1917, the world of the Industrial Revolution, the world of world wars, did not run on harmony. It ran on anxiety. It ran on conflict. It ran on a workforce that was stressed, disconnected, and dependent on the state for its survival. You cannot march a population into the trenches of World War I if they are vibrating at the frequency of peace. You cannot force men into coal mines and factories if their minds are clear and calm. To install the new system, they had to jam the signal of the old one. The Great Silencing was not just about melting metal. It was a global frequency shift. They took down the harmonic towers, the bells, the spires, the resonators, and they replaced them with a new grid. The electric grid, the radio grid, a grid that hums at 60 hertz, a frequency that is dissonant, jarring, and completely out of sync with human biology. They disconnected us from the earth and plugged us into the machine. Melnikov knew it. That's why he was erased. The Tartarian engineers knew it. That's why their schematics were burned. They weren't just protecting a technology, they were protecting a state of consciousness. And when the last great bell was lowered from its tower in St. Petersburg, when the spiral channels were filed flat and the resonant cavities filled with lead, we didn't just lose a piece of history. We lost the connection to ourselves. The silence that fell over the world in 1917 wasn't quiet. It was the deafening sound of a connection being severed. And we have been living in the static ever since. We are taught that history moves in a straight line, from primitive to advanced, from darkness to light. We are told that we are the apex of civilization, standing on the summit of progress. But after tracing the salt roads and listening to the silenced bells, I have realized that this is a lie. We did not climb out of ignorance. We fell into it. We are not the builders of the modern world. We are squatters living in the ruins of a superior one. The old world system, the hydraulic salt grid, the resonant atmospheric towers, the clean, silent energy, was not simply destroyed. It was overwritten. It was paved over with asphalt, wrapped in steel, and buried under the noise of the industrial age. But you cannot erase a continental machine completely. You can seal the chambers, you can melt the bells, but you cannot move the geography. The ghost of the machine is still guiding us.